Some stories begin with legends, others begin with tragedy. The tale of Din Djarin begins with both, woven together in a moment of fire and smoke that would reshape one young boy's destiny and, eventually, the fate of an entire people scattered across the stars. Before the Beskar armor, before the Razor Crest, before the child who would change everything, there was simply a boy. A child living on a world most galactic citizens had never heard of, in a village whose name would be lost to history along with nearly everyone who called it home. But from these humble, forgotten beginnings would emerge one of the most consequential figures of the New Republic era, a man whose actions would help determine whether the Mandalorian people would fade into myth or rise once more. The world before war, the planet Vatina, existed on the fringes of the Outer Rim, far from the gleaming towers of Coruscant and the major hyperspace lanes that connected the galaxy's great civilizations. It was a world of modest settlements, hard-working communities, and people who asked little from the galaxy except to be left in peace. The landscape varied from rocky highlands to fertile valleys, with small villages dotting the terrain like scattered seeds taking root in patient soil. In one such village, a family by the name of Din made their life. They were not wealthy, not influential, not remarkable by the standards that measured importance in the Republic's core worlds. They were simply people living their lives with the quiet dignity that comes from honest work and genuine connection to community. The father worked to provide, the mother tended to their home and their son, and together they formed the kind of family unit that represented billions across the galaxy, ordinary in every way except to those who loved them. Young Din Djarin, whose first name would one day become both a title and an identity, knew nothing of the great conflicts that raged across the stars during his early childhood. The Clone Wars, which had set the galaxy ablaze with unprecedented violence, seemed distant and unreal to the people of Vatina. Reports might filter through on HoloNet broadcasts, whispers of battles between the Grand Army of the Republic and the separatist droid forces, but these seemed like events happening in another universe entirely, disconnected from the rhythms of daily life on their remote world. The village itself embodied a simplicity that would later seem almost dreamlike to Din when his memories dared to surface. Stone and timber structures built to withstand the seasonal weather patterns, narrow streets where neighbors greeted each other by name, the smells of cooking fires and the sounds of children playing games as old as human civilization itself. For the young boy who would become the Mandalorian, these early years represented something he would spend the rest of his life unconsciously seeking to recapture: safety, belonging, the unquestioned certainty that tomorrow would come and that the people you loved would be there to share it. But the Clone Wars, whether the people of Vatina acknowledged them or not, had a way of spreading their tendrils into even the most remote corners of the galaxy. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, in its desperate struggle against the Republic, needed resources, strategic positions, and occasionally just targets of opportunity to demonstrate their reach and power. Vatina, for all its remoteness, possessed something the Separatists wanted, though what that something was would die with those who made the decision to attack. Perhaps it was minerals, perhaps a strategic location, perhaps simply the cruel mathematics of war that demanded action regardless of actual military value. The reasons mattered little to the families who would pay the price. All that mattered was that Acuvatina had drawn the attention of forces far beyond its ability to comprehend or resist. The day the sky fell, the attack came without warning, as such attacks often did. One moment, the village existed in its ordinary state, people going about their daily routines with the comfortable assumption that today would be much like yesterday. The next moment, the sky itself seemed to catch fire as separatist landing craft descended through the atmosphere, their hulls screaming through the air with a sound of approaching doom. For young Din, the transition from peace to chaos happened so quickly that his mind would later struggle to piece together a coherent narrative. There were the sounds first, the terrible mechanical shrieking of the dropships, unlike anything the peaceful village had ever experienced. Then came the thuds of impact as the craft touched down, followed by the mechanical precision of deployment ramps lowering and battle droids marching out in their remorseless, efficient formations. The separatist battle droids were many things, but merciful was not among them. These were B-1 and B-2 series droids, machines programmed for combat and occupation, incapable of empathy or discretion. To them, the village was simply a target, its inhabitants merely obstacles or potential threats to be neutralized. The fact that most of those inhabitants were civilians, families, children, registered no more significance to the droids' processors than the composition of the rocks beneath their feet. The attack was methodical, systematic, thorough. Blaster fire cut through the air, that distinctive whine and crack that would haunt Din's dreams for years to come. Buildings that had stood for generations burst into flames. People ran, some seeking shelter, others trying desperately to reach loved ones, still others simply fleeing in blind panic with no destination in mind beyond, away from here. Din's parents, in those final moments of their lives, did what parents across the galaxy have done since time immemorial when danger threatens their children. They hid him. In the chaos and terror, with death quite literally at their door, they found a storage compartment, a hatch in the floor of their home. The father lifted the young boy. The mother whispered something, words that would be lost forever in the confusion and fear of that moment, and together they placed their son in what they hoped would be safety. The hatch closed above Din, plunging him into darkness. Through the floor, muffled but unmistakable, came the sounds of destruction. Blaster fire, screams, the mechanical voices of droids announcing compliance or lack thereof, and then a sound that would define Din Djarin's life more than any other, an explosion, close and devastating, that shook the very foundations of the structure above him. In that darkness, trapped and terrified, the boy who would become the Mandalorian lost everything that defined his world. His parents died in that explosion, their final act one of desperate love, hiding their son in the hopes that somehow, some way, he might survive what they could not. The village around him burned, its people scattered, killed, or forced to flee. The life he had known, the future he might have had, all of it vaporized in minutes of mechanized violence. But death, having claimed so much, was not quite finished with Din Djarin. Above him, through the smoke and ruin, came the sound of mechanical footsteps. A B-2 super battle droid, more heavily armored and more dangerous than the standard B-1 units, had detected life signs. the hatch opened, and the young boy found himself staring up at a machine designed for killing, its blaster arm raising to eliminate this final witness to the village's destruction. Din Djarin's life should have ended there, just another statistic in a war that would claim trillions before its end. But fate, or the Force, or simple chance, intervened in a form that would define the rest of his existence. Warriors from the sky. The blaster shot that would have killed Din Djarin never came. Instead, the super battle droid that loomed over him exploded in a shower of sparks and shrapnel, blown apart by a precision shot from above. Through the smoke and fire descended a figure that to the terrified child must have seemed like something from ancient mythology. A warrior clad in armor that gleamed even in the dimness of destruction, rocket pack flaring as they descended with impossible grace and power. This was a Mandalorian warrior, one of the feared and legendary fighters whose reputation had spread across the galaxy for millennia. More specifically, this was a member of Death Watch, the militant faction that had broken away from Mandalore's government during the Clone Wars, rejecting the pacifist stance of Duchess Satine Kryze and maintaining the old warrior traditions of their people. Death Watch had been exiled from Mandalore proper, deemed terrorists and extremists by the ruling government. They had made their base on Concordia, one of Mandalore's moons, where they preserved the ancient ways and waited for an opportunity to reclaim what they saw as their birthright. But whatever one thought of their politics or their methods, in this moment they were saviors. The Mandalorian warrior moved with an efficiency born of years of training. More Death Watch members descended into the village, their jetpacks roaring as they engaged the remaining battle droids. What had been a one-sided massacre became briefly a battle. Mandalorian weapons, some of the finest in the galaxy, tore through droid armor with contemptuous ease. Beskar, the near-indestructible Mandalorian iron, turned aside blaster bolts that would have killed unarmored fighters. For Din, huddled in his hiding place, the next moments blurred into a confusion of sound and sensation. The Mandalorian who had saved him from the super battle droid reached down, and the boy found himself lifted in armored hands that, despite their strength, held him with unexpected gentleness. The warrior's helmet, with its distinctive T-shaped visor, looked down at him, and though Din could not see the face within, he could sense something. Evaluation, perhaps. Decision. Determination. Then they were moving, the Mandalorian's jetpack igniting as they lifted away from the ground, away from the burning village, away from everything Din had ever known. The young boy, too shocked even to scream, watched his world recede below him. The flames consuming his home, the scattered wreckage of his village, the bodies of droids and villagers alike scattered in the streets where he had played just hours before. The other Mandalorians finished their work with brutal efficiency, destroying the remaining battle droids before lifting off themselves. They had not come to Akvetina to save the village. That much was clear from how they left the burning settlement behind without attempting to aid the survivors. They had come for other reasons, perhaps pursuit of separatist forces, perhaps their own mysterious purposes. But they had not left empty-handed. They had found what Mandalorians called a foundling, an orphan of war, and in accordance with their ancient traditions, they would not abandon him. As the Mandalorian warriors flew away from Akvetina, the young Din Djarin looked back one final time at the world of his birth. Smoke rose in dark columns against the sky, marking the place where his parents lay dead, where his home had stood, where his old life had ended. He did not know it yet, but he would never return to this world. In his heart, though he was too young to articulate it, something fundamental had broken and reformed in a new configuration. The boy who had been Din of Akvatina was gone, consumed in the same flames that took his parents and his village. But from those ashes, carried away in Mandalorian arms, something new had been born. A foundling, a future warrior, a child of the Watch, the moon of warriors. Concordia, the moon where Death Watch had established their hidden base, could not have been more different from the modest village where Din had spent his early years. Where Akvatina had been peaceful and pastoral, Concordia was harsh and unforgiving. Its surface was scarred from ancient mining operations that had extracted Beskar ore for generations, leaving behind a landscape of rocky crags and deep valleys where the sun seemed reluctant to penetrate. The Death Watch installation itself was hidden within the moon's mountainous regions, a combination of ancient mining facilities and modern construction designed to avoid detection by Duchess Satine's forces on Mandalore. Here, in these secretive halls and training grounds, a culture existed in deliberate opposition to the new Mandalorian movement that had taken control of their homeworld. Where Satine's government promoted peace and pacifism, Death Watch glorified the warrior traditions. Where the new Mandalorians sought to put aside the violent past and embrace a future of diplomacy and cultural achievement, Death Watch clung fiercely to the idea that to be Mandalorian was fundamentally to be a warrior. They saw themselves not as terrorists or extremists, but as the true keepers of Mandalorian identity, the last guardians of a heritage that stretched back thousands of years to the days when Mandalorian armies had challenged even the Jedi themselves. Into this world of rigid discipline and warrior culture came young Din Djarin, traumatized, orphaned, and bearing witness to the worst that the galaxy's conflicts could inflict on innocent lives. To the Mandalorians who had rescued him, he represented both the responsibility and an opportunity. A foundling was sacred in Mandalorian culture, a child who had lost everything but could be given a new life, a new family, a new purpose. The transformation from terrified orphan to Mandalorian foundling did not happen overnight. Those early days on Concordia must have been overwhelming for the young boy, every sight and sound strange and foreign. The Mandalorians who had saved him spoke a language he barely understood. Mandoya, the ancient tongue of their people. They lived by codes and customs that seemed arbitrary and confusing to an outsider. They trained constantly for war, their entire society organized around the principle of martial readiness. But within this alien environment, Din found something he desperately needed: structure. Where his old life had been chaos and loss, his new life offered clear rules, defined expectations, and a path forward that required no complicated choices. Do as you are taught. Follow the creed. Train. Improve. Become. The specific faction of Death Watch that had claimed Din operated under an even stricter interpretation of Mandalorian tradition than others. They called themselves the Children of the Watch, and they followed what they believed to be the ancient way of the Mandalore. Central to their beliefs was a code that would define Din's entire life. Once a Mandalorian warrior had come of age and taken the creed they must never remove their helmet in the presence of another living being. To do so was to break the most sacred of vows, to cease being Mandalorian in any meaningful sense. This rule, which seemed extreme even to other Mandalorians, was presented to the young foundling not as one option among many, but as the fundamental truth of what it meant to be one of their people. Din, having no other frame of reference and desperate for the security and belonging the children to the Watch offered, accepted this teaching without question. It would become so ingrained in his identity that decades later, the very thought of removing his helmet in front of others would feel like a betrayal of everything he was. Training in the way. The children of the Watch did not simply tell their foundlings about Mandalorian warrior culture. They immersed them in it completely. Din's training began almost immediately, starting with the basics that all Mandalorian children learned, but taking on added urgency given his status as a foundling who needed to prove himself worthy of the armor he would someday wear. Physical conditioning came first. Mandalorian armor, especially when crafted from pure Beskar, was heavy and required considerable strength to wear effectively in combat. Young foundlings spent hours each day building their endurance, strength, and agility. They ran the rocky terrain of Concordia's surface, their lungs burning in the thin air. They climbed the sheer faces of abandoned mining operations, learning to find handholds where none seemed to exist. They practiced falls and rolls, training their bodies to react instinctively when thrown or knocked off balance. But physical prowess alone did not make a Mandalorian. Din also learned the technical skills that had made Mandalorian warriors feared across the galaxy for millennia. Weapons training consumed much of his time, starting with basic blasters and gradually advancing to the more sophisticated armaments that Mandalorians favored. He learned to strip, clean, maintain, and modify firearms until he could do it blindfolded, understanding intimately how each component worked and how to repair battle damage with whatever materials were available. Close combat received equal emphasis. While Mandalorians were justly famous for their advanced weaponry, they were equally skilled in hand-to-hand fighting. Din learned multiple martial arts styles, studying both the techniques specific to Mandalorian fighting traditions and adaptations from other combat forms encountered over generations of warfare. He practiced with training blades until his hands were calloused, learning not just how to strike, but when, where, and with what degree of force to achieve maximum effect. The armor itself became a subject of study. Mandalorian armor was not simply protective gear, but a symbol of identity, a tool of war, and a technological marvel. Din learned the history of Beskar, how it was mined from the depths of Mandalore and Concordia, how it was forged in ancient furnaces with techniques passed down through generations. He learned that Beskar could withstand blaster fire, lightsaber strikes, even explosions that would vaporize conventional armor. He learned that to wear Beskar was to carry the legacy of all who had worn it before. But more than physical skills or technical knowledge, Din absorbed the philosophical foundation of the Children of the Watch. They taught him their interpretation of the Risolnare, the 6 actions that defined what it meant to be Mandalorian: wearing armor, speaking the language, defending oneself and family, raising your children as Mandalorians, contributing to the clan's welfare, and rallying to the Mandalore when called. To these traditional tenets, the Children of the Watch added their own emphasis on the helmet rule and the importance of maintaining the old ways against the corruption they saw in modern Mandalorian society. Din learned their creation stories, the legends of Mandalore the First and the great crusades of ages past. He learned about the Taung, the original Mandalorian species who had conquered the planet Mandalore and given it their name, and how, over centuries, humans and near-humans had been adopted into Mandalorian culture until the species itself became less important than the shared identity of being Mandalorian. He learned that Mandalorian was not a matter of blood, but of creed, that anyone who followed the way and took the oaths could become truly one of them. This teaching must have been particularly significant for young Din, an outsider orphan with no biological connection to Mandalore or its people. The idea that he could truly become Mandalorian, not in some honorary sense, but as fully and completely as anyone born on the planet itself, offered him a new identity to replace what he had lost. He was not just Din the orphan, Din the survivor, Din the victim. He could become Din the Mandalorian, a warrior in an unbroken line stretching back thousands of years. The Rising Phoenix. As Din progressed in his training, he was introduced to more advanced skills that would set him apart even among Mandalorian warriors. One of the most important of these was the Rising Phoenix program, an elite training course focused on the use of jetpacks, arguably the most iconic piece of Mandalorian equipment after the armor itself. Jetpacks had been part of Mandalorian warfare for generations, providing mobility that few other forces in the galaxy could match. A Mandalorian with a jetpack was not bound to the ground like ordinary infantry, could flank positions that should have been secure, could retreat from untenable situations with ease. But jetpack operation was far from simple. The packs required extensive training to use safely, let alone effectively in combat. More than one aspiring Mandalorian had died learning to fly, either from crashes during training or from catastrophic pack failures in battle. The Rising Phoenix program lived up to its name, teaching students to literally rise from the ground like the legendary bird. Din learned the physics of flight, understanding thrust ratios and weight distribution. He practiced countless takeoffs and landings, first from level ground, then from various terrains and situations. He learned to fly in formation with other jetpack users, maintaining position and coordinating maneuvers. He practiced aerial combat, engaging targets both on the ground and in the air while managing the complex three-dimensional battlefield that flight created. Perhaps most importantly, he learned jetpack maintenance and emergency procedures. A jetpack malfunction during combat could be instantly fatal, so Mandalorian warriors were taught to check and double-check their equipment, to recognize the warning signs of potential failure, and to know instinctively what to do if something went wrong mid-flight. Din absorbed these lessons with the same dedication he brought to all his training, understanding that his life might someday depend on the knowledge being drilled into him. Through all of this training, Din was forming bonds with his fellow foundlings and the adult Mandalorians who served as instructors. In the absence of his biological family, the Children of the Watch became his family in truth. They shared meals together in the communal halls, their helmets remaining on even in privacy, the teaching of the creed absolute. They celebrated together when foundlings reached milestones in their training. They mourned together when members fell in battle or training accidents. The armorer, in particular, became a figure of great importance in Din's development. This Mandalorian woman, one of the few still trained in the ancient art of Beskar working, served not just as a craftsperson, but as a spiritual leader for the children of the Watch. She forged the armor that young Mandalorians would wear, but she also taught them what that armor meant, the responsibilities and honors that came with it. Her forge became almost a temple, a place where the practical and the sacred intersected. As Din moved through adolescence into young adulthood, he began to take on more responsibilities within the tribe, as the Children of the Watch community called itself. He went on his first real missions beyond Concordia, though the nature of these missions was shrouded in the secrecy that characterized Death Watch operations. He proved himself in combat, not against battle droids in training scenarios, but against real enemies who fought back with live weapons and lethal intent. Those who trained with Din noted that he possessed a particular skill set that would serve him well in the life ahead. He was not the strongest of the foundlings, nor the fastest, nor the most naturally gifted in combat. But he was thorough, methodical, impossible to shake once he had committed to a course of action. He learned from his mistakes with a dedication that bordered on obsession, and he possessed something that could not be taught, an iron will forged in the trauma of his childhood, a determination to never again be the helpless victim he had been on Acuvatina. The scars of that day never fully healed. Indeed, the Mandalorians did not particularly encourage him to forget or move past his trauma. The Children of the Watch believed that struggle forged strength, that pain could be transformed into purpose. Din's memories of his parents' deaths, of the village burning, of the droids that had destroyed everything, these were not weaknesses to be overcome, but fuel for the warrior he was becoming. His hatred of droids in particular would stay with him for decades, a visceral reaction he could not fully control, even when he knew intellectually that not all droids were the enemy. When the time came for Din to take the creed and receive his armor, the ceremony was solemn and profound. The armorer herself presided, as was tradition. In the presence of the assembled tribe, Din swore the oaths that would define the rest of his life. He pledged to defend himself and his family, to raise his children as Mandalorians, to wear the armor, to speak the language, to contribute to the clan's welfare, and most importantly for the Children of the Watch, he swore never to remove his helmet before another living being, to keep his face hidden from the world as a sign of his devotion to the way. The armor the armorer created for Din was not made of pure Beskar, not yet. True Beskar was rare and precious, reserved for those who had proven themselves multiple times over. But the armor she forged was still formidable, a combination of Beskar and other metals that would protect him in battle while announcing to any who saw him exactly what he was, a Mandalorian warrior trained in the ancient traditions, dangerous and dedicated. With his armor complete and his oaths sworn, Din Djarin was no longer a foundling. He was now a full member of the tribe, a warrior of the Children of the Watch. He had earned the right to wear the helmet that he would almost never remove, the symbol of his identity and his commitment to the way of the Mandalore, as his people understood it. Shadows, over Mandalore. But even as Din was completing his transformation from orphan child to Mandalorian warrior, events were unfolding across the galaxy that would shape his future in ways he could not have imagined. The Clone Wars ground toward their conclusion, though that conclusion would not bring the peace so many hoped for. Instead, it brought the rise of the Galactic Empire, an autocratic regime that would view Mandalore and its warrior culture with deep suspicion. The Children of the Watch, operating from Concordia and maintaining their opposition to the pacifist government of Mandalore, found themselves navigating increasingly dangerous waters. The Empire was not the Republic, which had at least nominally respected Mandalore's independence. The Empire tolerated no rivals, no groups that might pose even a potential military threat to its absolute authority. The exact sequence of events that led to what Mandalorians would come to call the Great Purge varied depending on who told the story. But the outcome was always the same: devastation. The Empire, in a campaign of systematic destruction, attacked Mandalore and its associated worlds. The assault was not meant simply to conquer or occupy, but to break the Mandalorian people entirely, to ensure they could never again rise as a unified military force. The weapon used in the final stage of the Purge would become known as the Night of 1,000 Tears. Imperial forces bombarded the surface of Mandalore so heavily that, according to some accounts, they turned the planet's surface to glass, sterilizing entire regions and making them uninhabitable. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to radioactive rubble. The population, already diminished by years of internal conflict and civil war, was decimated. Din Djarin, by this time a young warrior finding his place within the tribe, witnessed the aftermath of the Purge from Concordia. The Children of the Watch, having already been in hiding and operating in secret, were somewhat insulated from the worst of the destruction. But they could not help but see what was happening to their homeworld, to their people. The skies over Mandalore glowed with the fires of burning cities. Imperial star destroyers hung in orbit like carrion birds, their turbo lasers methodically destroying anything that might serve as a rallying point for Mandalorian resistance. The armorer would later tell Din and others that the Purge was the cost of Mandalore's betrayal of the old ways, that by embracing pacifism and abandoning the warrior traditions, the Mandalorians had invited their own destruction. Whether or not this interpretation was accurate, it became the foundational teaching of the Children of the Watch's worldview. They had been right to maintain the old ways. They had been right to hide. They had been right to keep the creed. And now, they were among the last true Mandalorians left alive. In the aftermath of the Purge, the tribe scattered. Staying together in one location had become too dangerous, as the Empire hunted the survivors with systematic determination. Small groups of Mandalorians dispersed across the Outer Rim, maintaining contact when possible, but primarily focused on simple survival. The dream of reclaiming Mandalore, which had driven Death Watch for so long, seemed more distant than ever. The planet itself was rumored to be cursed, poisoned, uninhabitable. To return there was death. Din Djarin, still a relatively young warrior, found himself part of this diaspora. The tribe that had raised him from childhood fragmented its members going their separate ways with promises to reunite when circumstances permitted. Some sought remote worlds where they could hide. Others, like Din, chose a different path. The bounty hunter's path. In the chaotic years following the Purge, Din Djarin made a decision that would define the next phase of his life. He would become a bounty hunter. The choice was practical more than idealistic. A lone Mandalorian needed income to survive, to maintain his armor and equipment, to acquire the resources necessary for the warrior life. Bounty hunting offered steady work for those skilled in combat and tracking, and it asked few questions about one's past or affiliations. The Bounty Hunters Guild, a loose organization that connected hunters with clients willing to pay for their services, provided the structure Din needed. He registered with the guild, began taking jobs, and slowly built a reputation as a reliable, if expensive, operator. His Mandalorian armor made him stand out in a profession where anonymity was often prized, but it also sent a clear message to both targets and competitors. Here was someone not to be trifled with. Din's approach to bounty hunting reflected the methodical, thorough personality he had developed during his training. He was not flashy, not interested in fame or notoriety for its own sake. He simply did the job, collected his pay, and moved on to the next contract. He followed the guild code scrupulously, understanding that in a profession where trust was scarce, having a reputation for reliability was worth more than any individual payout. His ship during these years was an ST-70 assault ship, better known as a Razor Crest. The ship was old even when Din acquired it, pre-Empire vintage, but it suited his needs perfectly. It was durable, modifiable, and could land in places where newer, more sophisticated ships might struggle. The Razor Crest became more than just transportation. It became Din's home, the one constant in a life of constant movement from one job to the next. The work itself varied. Sometimes the targets were simple bail jumpers, people who had fled before facing justice and needed to be returned. Sometimes they were more dangerous, fugitive criminals, rogue droids, occasionally even individuals wanted by the remnants of the Empire. Din did not particularly care about the morality of the bounties he pursued. The guild code did not require him to judge whether someone deserved to be caught, only to verify that the bounty was legitimate and collect a target as specified. This period of Din's life, which lasted several years, was characterized by the isolation. He worked alone, trusted no one, spoke little. The helmet he wore served multiple purposes. Yes, it fulfilled the requirements of his creed, never to be removed in the presence of others. But it also created a barrier between himself and everyone he encountered, a literal mask behind which he could hide whatever feelings or doubts he might have. To the galaxy at large, he was simply the Mandalorian, a faceless hunter who always brought in his targets, preferably alive but dead if necessary. He maintained some contact with the remnants of his tribe, meeting with them occasionally when their paths crossed or when he could afford to detour to wherever they had temporarily settled. The armorer and Paz Vizsla, a fellow warrior from the Children of the Watch, became his primary connections to the community that had raised him. He would turn over a portion of his earnings to the tribe, contributing to their collective survival and to the care of new foundlings, children orphaned by the Empire's continued campaigns of suppression. But increasingly, Din Djarin's life was solitary. He would spend weeks or even months alone in the Razor Crest, traveling between worlds, tracking targets, collecting bounties. He spoke when necessary for his work, but otherwise maintained silence. He ate alone, slept alone, existed in a bubble of enforced isolation that was partly necessity and partly choice. The trauma of his childhood, the orphaning on Akvatina, the loss of everything he had known, continued to shape him in ways he might not have fully recognized. He kept people at a distance not just because the creed demanded physical separation, but because emotional attachment felt dangerous. Everyone he had ever truly cared for had been taken from him. First his birth family on Akvatina, then his adopted family when the tribe scattered. The logical conclusion, though he would never have articulated it so clearly, was that caring for others was a vulnerability he could not afford. And so Din Djarin lived, a solitary hunter, moving through the outer rim, taking jobs, collecting bounties, maintaining his armor and his ship and his skills. He developed a reputation within the guild as one of the best, someone who could be trusted with difficult jobs. He was expensive, but he delivered results. The other hunters knew of him, knew to stay clear when he was on a job, knew that trying to steal his bounties was a quick path to a painful lesson in why Mandalorians were still feared even after the purge. But this existence, however successful by the metrics of his profession, was fundamentally hollow. Din was surviving, even thriving in certain ways, but he was not truly living. He went through the motions of life without connection, without purpose beyond the next job and the next payday. He was, in many ways, stuck in a kind of stasis, unable to move forward from the losses that had defined him. That would all change, though he did not know it yet, when he accepted what seemed like a routine bounty on a remote desert world. The target was specified only by age 50 years old, and the payout was unusually generous. The client was mysterious, affiliated with Imperial remnants, but Din had worked for questionable clients before. It was just another job that would change everything. The planet Arvala 7 was unremarkable in every way except the misery of its environment. A barren world in the outer rim, it offered little to attract settlers or traders. Its rocky landscape was home to scattered moisture farms and the occasional Jawa clan scavenging for salvage. It was exactly the kind of place where someone might hide something valuable, precisely because no one would think to look there. Din Djarin landed the Razor Crest on Arvala 7's dusty surface with no particular expectations. He had been sent here by Grief Karga, the bounty hunters guild agent who typically connected him with jobs. The bounty was unusual in its generosity, a Beskar ingot as down payment with more promised upon delivery. But Din had learned not to ask too many questions when good money was involved. The client, operating out of a fortified compound on Navarro, had given minimal information. Retrieve an asset, 50 years old, last known location on Arvala 7. Alive was preferred, but proof of death would still receive compensation. The first challenge came almost immediately after landing. A creature native to Arvala 7 called a blurg attacked Din with the territorial aggression common to the local fauna. The bounty hunter fought back with his flamethrower, but the beast was persistent and surprisingly resilient. Din found himself moments from being trampled when an unexpected savior appeared, an Ugnaught vapor farmer named Kuil. Kuil, riding his own tamed blurg, stunned Din's attacker and helped the Mandalorian to his feet. The Ugnaught was unlike anyone Din had encountered in his bounty hunting career. He spoke with formal precision, carried himself with quiet dignity, and showed no fear or particular interest in the armored warrior who had crash-landed into his territory. "I have spoken," Queel would say at the end of declarations, a personal verbal signature that announced when his position on a matter was final. The Ugnaught offered to help Din locate the bounty in exchange for one thing, that Din learned to ride a blurg properly, rather than relying on mechanical transportation. It was a strange request, but Din was in no position to refuse local expertise. Over the next hours, Queel patiently taught the Mandalorian how to mount, control, and ride the massive reptilian creatures that were native to Arvala 7. The Discovery Queel guided Din to the location where the bounty was supposedly hidden, a remote moisture farm that had been converted into a fortified encampment. As they approached, Din's practiced eye noted the defensive preparations: automated turrets, guards posted at strategic points, kill zones established around the perimeter. Whoever had set up this location knew what they were doing and expected trouble. What Din did not expect was to encounter a rival. As he scouted the perimeter, a bounty droid designated IG-11 arrived with the same objective. The IG series assassin droids had a fearsome reputation, and IG-11 lived up to it. After a tense standoff, Din and the droid reached an uneasy alliance. They would assault the compound together, splitting the bounty once they had retrieved it. The attack was brutal and efficient. Din's Mandalorian combat training combined with IG-11's targeting protocols made them a devastatingly effective team. They cut through the Nikto Guard systematically, using overlap in the fields of fire and coordinated movements that left their enemies no chance to organize an effective defense. Within minutes, what had been a fortified position was a charnel house, bodies scattered among the wreckage of defensive emplacements. They breached the final door together, both expecting to find a 50-year-old bounty, perhaps a criminal or fugitive of some importance. What they found instead stopped them both completely. In a hovering pram in the center of the room was an infant. Not a human infant, but something Din had never seen before. A small, green, clearly sentient being with large ears and enormous dark eyes that looked up at the two armed figures with an expression that might have been curiosity or fear or perhaps both. The creature, whoever or whatever it was, could not have been more than 2 feet tall. This was the asset. This child was the bounty worth a small fortune in Beskar. IG-11's programming was clear. Species age differently, the droid observed, its targeting systems locking onto the infant. Perhaps it could live many centuries. Sadly, we'll never know. The blaster raised, a cold mechanical judgment that this small being matched the parameters and therefore must be eliminated. Din Djarin's response was pure instinct, faster than conscious thought. His blaster fired, the shot perfectly placed to destroy the assassin droid before it could fire. IG-11 collapsed in a heap of sparking components while the infant in the pram looked on, seemingly uncomprehending of how close death had come. In that moment, everything changed. Din had no logical reason to save the child. The bounty would pay regardless of whether it was delivered alive or dead. The smart play would have been to let the droid do what droids did, collect the remains and complete the transaction. But something about the sight of a weapon pointed at a defenseless infant triggered a reaction deeper than logic or professional calculation. Perhaps it was the memory of being a helpless child himself, cowering in a hiding place while death came for everyone he knew. Perhaps it was the Mandalorian teaching that foundlings, children without protection, were sacred. Perhaps it was simply a basic humanity that his years as a bounty hunter had not entirely suppressed. Whatever the reason, Din had made his choice before he even realized he was choosing. The child looked up at him, those enormous eyes meeting the dark visor of his helmet, and something passed between them. Recognition of a kind, though of what, Din could not have said. He reached down, closed the pram, and prepared to transport the child back to his ship. The first bond, the journey back to the Razor Crest with the infant, provided Din's first real opportunity to process what he had just acquired. The child, whom he could not yet name, seemed remarkably calm for a 50-year-old being who appeared to be no more developed than a human toddler. It watched Din with an intensity that was almost unsettling, as if comprehending far more than its apparent age would suggest. Din's first challenge was practical. The Razor Crest had been systematically stripped by Jawas during his absence, the scavenging creatures making off with critical components that left his ship unable to fly. Kuiil agreed to help negotiate with the Jawas, who demanded an unusual price for the return of the stolen parts. The egg of a mudhorn, a dangerous beast that lived in the caves nearby. Din approached the mudhorn's lair with the tactical precision that had kept him alive through countless bounties. He left the child safely hidden in what he believed was a secure location and entered the cave alone. The mudhorn, when it finally emerged, was every bit as dangerous as advertised, a massive horned beast that charged with enough force to shatter rock. The battle went poorly from the start. Din's weapons, effective against sentient opponents, seemed to barely register against the mudhorn's thick hide and fury. He was thrown, trampled, battered against the cave walls with bone-jarring impact. His armor saved his life repeatedly, but even Beskar had its limits. As the mudhorn prepared for what would certainly be a killing charge, Din's consciousness wavering from the impacts he had absorbed, something impossible happened. The child, who had somehow followed Din to the cave despite supposedly being left behind in safety, raised one small hand. The mudhorn, in mid-charge, suddenly lifted off the ground, held suspended by some invisible force. The creature thrashed and roared, but it could not break free of whatever power the child was exerting. Din, through the haze of pain and confusion, could only stare as this infant he barely knew manipulated reality itself with apparent ease. The Force. Din did not know the term yet, did not understand what he was witnessing, but he knew it was not normal, not natural by the standards of anything he had experienced. This child was not just unusual, it was powerful in ways that defied explanation. With the mudhorn immobilized, Din managed to drive his vibroblade into its neck, ending the fight. The beast dropped to the ground as the child lowered its hand, looking exhausted from the effort. Din claimed the mudhorn egg and returned it to the Jawas, who feasted on the yolk inside with evident delight. His ship parts were returned, and Kuiil helped him install them. The Ugnaught wisely asking no questions about what he had witnessed. As Din and Kuiil worked to restore the Razor Crest, they tried to make sense of what the child had done. Kuiil, with his wider experience of the galaxy, suggested it might be sorcery or some form of advanced technology. Din had no better explanation. All he knew was that this bounty was far more complicated than anything in his career. The impossible choice. Din returned to Nevarro with the child secured in his ship, his mind wrestling with contradictory obligations. The contract was clear: deliver the asset to the client. The pay was extraordinary, enough Beskar to forge a full set of armor, wealth that most bounty hunters would never see in their careers. The professional thing to do, the logical thing to do, was to complete the transaction and move on to the next job. The client turned out to be associated with the remnants of the empire, operating through a mysterious intermediary known only as the client. With him was Dr. Pershing, a scientist who seemed particularly interested in the child for reasons he would not fully explain. They accepted delivery of the asset with evident satisfaction, paying Din the promised Beskar and dismissing him. Din took the Beskar to the armorer, the leader of his covert on Nevarro, who could forge the sacred metal into proper Mandalorian armor. As she worked the Beskar in her forge, the metal glowing with heat, Din found his thoughts constantly returning to the child. The armorer noticed his distraction. "What troubles you?" she asked, her hammer ringing against Beskar with rhythmic precision. "The foundling," Din admitted, and even saying it aloud felt like a confession. "The bounty. They're going to kill him." The armorer paused in her work, fixing Din with the steady gaze of her helmet. "It is not your concern. You completed your transaction." But even as she said it, they both knew that foundlings were sacred to Mandalorians, that children without protection were meant to be defended, not delivered to those who would harm them. The armorer continued her work, forging Din's Beskar into a new pauldron and other armor pieces, but her words had done nothing to settle his conscience. Din left the forge wearing his new armor, the Beskar gleaming, marking him as a Mandalorian of substance and honor. He went to the guild cantina where Grief Karga presided, intending to collect his next bounty puck and continue his career. But as he sat in that cantina, surrounded by other bounty hunters, the full weight of what he had done crashed down on him. He had delivered a child, a foundling, to certain death or worse. He had taken payment for it. He had followed the letter of the guild code while violating everything his people stood for at a fundamental level. The other hunters in the cantina watched him with a mixture of envy and suspicion, knowing he had just completed a bounty worth more than any of them had seen. Din's hand moved to the controls of his vambrace, triggering the tracking beacon he had placed on the child. The signal showed the child's location in the Imperial compound. Still alive, for now. Still there. The decision, when it came, was not really a decision at all. It was instinct, need, a fundamental inability to live with what he had done. Din stood, left the cantina, and made his way through Nevarro streets to the Imperial facility. There was no plan, no elaborate scheme. There was only the certainty that he could not let this stand. Breaking the code. The rescue was direct, violent, and completely against everything the guild code represented. Din infiltrated the Imperial compound using a combination of stealth and overwhelming force. The client's guards, mostly stormtroopers, were no match for a Mandalorian warrior who had nothing to lose. Din cut through them with methodical efficiency, his weapons and armor making him essentially unstoppable against their standard issue equipment. He found the child in a medical lab, strapped to instruments while Dr. Pershing ran tests. The scientist backed away as Din entered, hands raised, stammering explanations about orders and experiments. Din ignored him, freeing the child from its restraints and securing it in its pram. The child looked up at him with those enormous eyes, and Din found himself wondering if it understood what he was risking, what this rescue would cost. The alarm sounded as Din made his exit. Every bounty hunter on Navarro would now be hunting him, the penalty for breaking the guild code absolute. And more than that, he had made an enemy of an imperial client, someone with resources and connections that would not easily forget this betrayal. Din had just thrown away his career, his reputation, possibly his life, for this small creature he barely understood. He fought his way out of the compound and through the streets of Navarro, every bounty hunter in the city converging on him. Din's armor saved him repeatedly, Beskar turning aside blaster bolts that would have killed him instantly. But there were too many, the attacks coming from multiple directions, and even a Mandalorian could only fight so many opponents at once. When death seemed inevitable, salvation came from an unexpected source. Members of Din's tribe, the scattered remnants of his covert who had been living hidden on Navarro, suddenly appeared. They descended from the rooftops and buildings, their jetpacks flaring, laying down covering fire that scattered the pursuing hunters. The armorer herself appeared, her heavy hammer crushing bounty hunters who got too close. "A foundling is in your care," she told Din, her voice carrying absolute authority. "By creed, until it is of age or reunited with its own kind, you are as its father. This is the way." "This is the way," Din and the other Mandalorians responded in unison, the ritual phrase that punctuated their most important declarations. The tribe bought Din the time he needed to reach the Razor Crest. As he lifted off, he could see the scattered Mandalorians retreating into the shadows, disappearing back into hiding. He knew what this had cost them. Their covert was compromised, their safe haven on Navarro destroyed. They would scatter again, flee again, all because he had broken the guild code to save one child. As the Razor Crest broke atmosphere and jumped to hyperspace, Din looked at the child secured in its pram. The foundling looked back at him, making a small cooing sound. Din Djarin's life as a solitary bounty hunter was over. Something new had begun, though he did not yet know what to call it. The hunted. The next months became a blur of running, hiding, and fighting off bounty hunters who sought the substantial price on both Din and the child. The guild had put out the word: massive payment for the return of the bounty and the capture of the rogue Mandalorian. Every hunter in the sector was looking for them. Din took the child to the remote world of Sorgan, hoping its backwater status would provide temporary sanctuary. There they encountered Cara Dune, a former shock trooper for the Rebel Alliance, who had herself fled to Sorgan to escape her past. At first, Cara and Din clashed, two warriors testing each other in the muddy streets of a village. But they reached an understanding, and when the village needed protection from raiders using an old Imperial ATST walker, Din and Cara joined forces to defend them. The village on Sorgan offered something Din had not experienced in years: peace, community, the possibility of a life that was not constantly moving to stay ahead of danger. Omera, one of the village women, showed kindness to both Din and the child. For a brief moment, Din allowed himself to imagine staying, settling, perhaps even removing his helmet in privacy and attempting something like normalcy. But a bounty hunter found them even there, and Din realized that nowhere would be safe as long as the price on their heads remained. He said goodbye to Omera and the village, to the brief glimpse of peace they had offered, and returned to the stars with the child. Tatooine provided their next stop, where the Razor Crest's engines required repairs. At Hangar 35 in Mos Eisley, Din met Peli Motto, a cantankerous but skilled mechanic who ran the bay with the help of her pit droids. The child took an immediate liking to Peli, and she to it, though she complained constantly about the expense and difficulty of the repairs needed. To pay for the work, Din took on a job with a young bounty hunter named Toro Calican, tracking down the elite mercenary Fennec Shand in Tatooine's desert wastes. They successfully captured Shand, but Calican betrayed Din, seeing an opportunity to claim both the bounty on Fennec and the larger prize on Din and the child. Din killed Calican and left Tatooine, paying Peli with the credits he had recovered, but not every pursuit ended in violence. Din received a message from Greef Karga, the guild agent who had initially sent him to Arvala 7. Karga proposed a deal: help clear Navarro of the Imperial presence that had taken over the city in the aftermath of Din's rescue, and the bounty on him would be lifted. It was obviously a trap, but it was also potentially a way to end the constant running. Din gathered allies for the mission. He returned to Sorgan and recruited Cara Dune, whose combat skills and experience with the Empire would prove invaluable. He traveled back to Arvala 7 and convinced Kuiil to join them, the Ugnaught agreeing out of his sense of honor and his growing affection for the child. Kuiil brought with him a reprogrammed IG-11, the same model as the assassin droid Din had destroyed, now repurposed as a protective guardian. The Siege of Navarro. The mission to Navarro went wrong almost from the start. What was supposed to be a straightforward operation to eliminate the Imperial client and a few stormtroopers turned out to be far more complicated. The client was revealed to be working for someone much more dangerous. Moff Gideon, a former ISB officer who had played a key role in the Great Purge of Mandalore. The revelation of Gideon's involvement changed everything. This was not some minor Imperial remnant operation, but a deliberate attempt to capture the child for purposes Din did not fully understand. Moff Gideon seemed to know everything about Din, including his real name, which he had never used in his bounty hunting career. The Moff spoke of the Purge, of the destruction of Mandalore, taunting Din with the knowledge that he had been there, had participated in the genocide of Din's adopted people. The battle that followed was desperate. Gideon's forces had superior numbers and firepower, pinning Din and his allies in Navarro streets. During the fighting, Kuiil was killed by scout troopers while trying to protect the child, sacrificing himself to save the foundling he had come to care for. The child was captured by Gideon's forces, taken aboard the Moff's light cruiser that orbited above the city. Din and his surviving allies, including Cara Dune and Greef Karga, found themselves pinned down in a cantina, surrounded by stormtroopers. It was IG-11, following its reprogramming to protect the child, that saved them, walking directly into the enemy fire and using its body to shield Din as they fought their way to the child's location. The Mandalorian covert, what was left of it, revealed itself one final time. The armorer emerged from the ruins of their hidden base, and in a sequence that would later seem almost sacred to Din, she performed a ritual. She forged a signet for his armor, the symbol of the Mudhorn, representing the beast he had fought when the child had first revealed its power. She declared Din and the child a clan of two, a formal family bond in Mandalorian tradition. "This is the way," she intoned, and Din repeated it, accepting the responsibility, the honor, and the burden of being the child's father in all but biology. The armorer also gave Din a new quest, one that would shape everything that followed. He must return the child to its own kind. Somewhere in the galaxy were others of the child's species, or at least those who could understand and train its mysterious abilities. Finding them would not be easy, but it was now Din's sacred duty as the foundling's guardian. The hunt for the Jedi. With Navarro behind them and the immediate Imperial threat temporarily dispersed, Din began the difficult task of locating the child's kind. He knew almost nothing about the child's species, had no leads on where to begin searching. His first breakthrough came from fellow Mandalorians. On the ocean moon of Trask, Din encountered other Mandalorians led by Bo-Katan Kryze. Bo-Katan was no member of the Children of the Watch. She removed her helmet freely, fought alongside her comrades Casca Reeves and Axe Woves, and represented a very different interpretation of what it meant to be Mandalorian. Her revelation that Din's sect was not the only or even mainstream form of Mandalorian culture shook him deeply. But Bo-Katan, despite their ideological differences, helped Din. She told him what he needed to know. The child's abilities were those of the Jedi, the ancient order of Force users who had once been the Republic's guardians. If Din wanted to find the child's kind, he needed to find a Jedi, and she knew where one could be found, Ahsoka Tano, on the forest world of Corvus. Din traveled to Corvus and found the planet's capital, Caladan, under the cruel rule of Morgan Elsbeth, an imperial magistrate who had turned the city into a tyrannical fiefdom. Ahsoka Tano, the former Jedi, was attempting to liberate the city, but she needed help. Din and Ahsoka struck a deal. Help her defeat Elsbeth, and she would help him with the child. Working together, they freed Caladan. In the process, Ahsoka communed with the child through the Force, learning things about him that no one else could have discovered. She told Din the child's name, Grogu. She told him that Grogu had been raised at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, that he had survived the Great Purge of the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars, that he had been hidden away for decades until falling into the hands of the Imperial Remnant. But despite the child's Jedi heritage, Ahsoka refused to train him. She sensed fear and attachment in Grogu, particularly attachment to Din, and she believed these emotions made him unsuitable for Jedi training. The old Jedi Order had forbidden such attachments, and Ahsoka had seen the dangers they could lead to in her own master, Anakin Skywalker. Instead, Ahsoka gave Din a direction. Take Grogu to the ancient Jedi temple on Tython, to a seeing stone where he might reach out through the Force to any remaining Jedi who might hear him and be willing to train him. She also gave Din a gift, a Beskar spear taken from Morgan Elsbeth, one of the few weapons in the galaxy that could stand up to a lightsaber. The separation on Tython, as Grogu meditated on the Seeing Stone, reaching out through the Force, Moff Gideon struck. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Dark troopers, advanced combat droids encased in Beskar-like armor, descended from Gideon's cruiser. The Razor Crest, Din's home and transport, was destroyed in a single, devastating turbo-laser blast from orbit. Din fought desperately to protect Grogu, but he was outmatched and outnumbered. Just when the situation seemed impossible, two unexpected allies arrived, Boba Fett and Fennec Shand. Boba, the clone of the famous Mandalorian warrior, Jango Fett, had tracked his father's armor to the Razor Crest and wanted it back. Fennec, the mercenary Din had captured on Tatooine, had been rescued and modified by Boba. Together, they fought off the initial attack, but Grogu was taken by the Dark Troopers before they could prevent it. Boba and Fennec agreed to help Din mount a rescue, honoring the debt they owed for the return of Boba's armor. Din assembled a team that included not just Boba and Fennec, but also Bo-Katan, Casca Reeves, and Cara Dune. They would assault Gideon's light cruiser directly, rescue Grogu, and end the Moff's threat once and for all. The assault on the cruiser was audacious and extremely dangerous. The team fought their way through stormtroopers and security systems, with Din eventually confronting Moff Gideon directly. Gideon wielded the Darksaber, an ancient Mandalorian weapon that was also a symbol of leadership over the Mandalorian people. In the duel that followed, Din's Beskar spear proved the superior weapon, and he defeated Gideon, claiming the Darksaber in the process. When Din tried to give the Darksaber to Bo-Katan, believing it rightfully belonged to her as the former leader of Mandalore, she refused. Gideon, battered but defiant, laughed at Din's ignorance. According to Mandalorian tradition, the Darksaber could only be won in combat. By defeating Gideon, Din had become the rightful owner and therefore had a claim to lead the Mandalorian people. He could not simply give it away. Bo-Katan would have to defeat him in combat to claim it. Before this new conflict could escalate, the Dark Troopers that Din had ejected into space returned, breaching the ship's hull and advancing on the bridge where Din and his allies had taken refuge with Grogu. Even working together, they could not stop the advanced droids. Death seemed inevitable. Then a single X-Wing appeared on the sensors, and a lone figure boarded the ship. What happened next became the stuff of legend. A Jedi robed in black cut through the Dark Troopers with a grace and power that left everyone watching in awe. Green lightsaber flashing, he destroyed every droid between himself and the bridge, moving with a certainty that spoke of complete mastery of the Force. When the doors finally opened, Din saw who had come. Luke Skywalker, the Jedi who had destroyed the Empire, son of Anakin Skywalker, legend made flesh. Grogu had reached through the Force, and Luke had answered the call. Luke said he would train Grogu in the ways of the Jedi, would help him understand and control his abilities. It was what Din had been seeking for months, the culmination of his quest to return Grogu to his kind. This was what the armorer had commanded, what honor and duty demanded. Din should have been relieved, satisfied that his mission was complete. Instead, his heart was breaking. Grogu reached out to Din, wanting to be held one final time before going with Luke. And Din, who had not removed his helmet in front of another living being since he took the creed, made a choice. Slowly, reverently, he lifted the helmet from his head. The galaxy did not end. The way did not collapse. But something fundamental shifted. For the first time since childhood, Din Djarin showed his face to another person, and in doing so, he revealed the depth of what Grogu had come to mean to him. This was not duty. This was not obligation. This was love, raw and undeniable. Grogu reached up, touching Din's face with one small hand, seeing for the first time the features of the father who had protected him, saved him, and loved him. Din smiled, tears on his cheeks, and said goodbye. Luke Skywalker took Grogu and departed, and Din Djarin replaced his helmet. Around him, his allies stood in respectful silence, understanding without words what they had just witnessed. Bo-Katan, who had argued for months that Din's sect was wrong about the helmet rule, said nothing. Even she could see that the cost of what Din had just done was immense. Moff Gideon was taken into custody by Cara Dune, who had been commissioned as a New Republic Marshal. The crisis was over. Grogu was safe, on his way to proper training with the last of the Jedi. Everything had worked out as well as could be hoped. But as Din Djarin left the light cruiser and returned to contemplate his next move, he carried with him a new weight. He had violated the creed. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his sect. And worse, he had lost the child who, in the space of mere months, had become the center of his entire world. The quest that had defined him was over. What came next? He did not know. The galaxy did not stop turning simply because Din Djarin's world had ended. The New Republic continued its work of rebuilding after the Empire's fall. Moff Gideon sat in a New Republic prison, awaiting trial for war crimes. Luke Skywalker, somewhere in the vastness of space, was beginning the monumental task of training a new generation of Jedi, including one small green foundling who ate entirely too many frogs. And Din Djarin returned to the only life he had ever really known, alone, wandering, taking bounties to survive. But everything was different now. The Razor Crest was destroyed, forcing him to take public transport like a common traveler. The child who had traveled with him, who had given his life purpose beyond simple survival, was gone. And hanging over everything was the knowledge that he had violated his creed, had removed his helmet before others, had broken the most sacred vow of the Children of the Watch. The weight of apostasy, Din's first destination after the separation from Grogu, was the Glavis Ring World, where the remnants of his tribe had established a new covert. The scattered Mandalorians had regrouped in the shadows of the massive space station, continuing their tradition of secrecy and isolation. Din sought them out, partly because he needed them, partly because he needed to face what he had done. The reunion with his people was bittersweet. Paz Vizsla, the massive Mandalorian warrior who had fought alongside Din during the rescue on Navarro, greeted him with the usual ritual phrases. The armorer, ever the spiritual center of their group, received him in her forge, the familiar ring of her hammer on Beskar, echoing through the space. Din had brought gifts. The Beskar spear that Ahsoka Tano had given him, an offering to be repurposed for the tribe's needs. He had also brought the Darksaber, though he understood its significance far better now than when he had first claimed it from Moff Gideon. The armorer examined the ancient weapon with interest, explaining its history, how it had been created by Tara Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, and how it had become a symbol of leadership over the Mandalorian people. But the conversation could not avoid the central issue. "Have you ever removed your helmet?" the armorer asked, her voice carrying the weight of ritual interrogation rather than simple curiosity. "No," Din answered immediately, the denial automatic. "Has it ever been removed by others?" Din hesitated, remembering IG-11 taking off his helmet to heal him on Navarro, remembering the medical droids that had scanned him. "Yes." The armorer's judgment was immediate and absolute. "This is the way no longer. You are a Mandalorian no more." The words hit Din like a physical blow. Apostate, cast out. Everything he had built his identity around since childhood, the traditions that had given meaning to his existence after the trauma of Akavatina, stripped away in a sentence. He tried to argue, to explain, but the armorer was unmoved. The creed was clear. He had broken it. There were consequences, but she also offered hope, a path to redemption that seemed almost impossible in its difficulty. "You must journey to the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore," she told him. "Only by bathing in those waters can you be redeemed in the eyes of the creed." The problem was immediately obvious. Mandalore had been destroyed in the Great Purge, its surface supposedly turned to glass by the Empire's bombardment during the Night of 1,000 Tears. The living waters, if they even still existed, would be buried beneath the ruins of a poisoned, cursed world that no Mandalorian had set foot on in years. The armorer herself believed it was impossible. Din left the covert an outcast, excluded from the only family he had known since childhood. The darksaber weighed heavy on his belt, a symbol of authority he did not want and could not freely relinquish. His path forward was unclear, his identity fractured, his purpose uncertain. The Tatooine interlude. Din's next destination was Tatooine, where he had left a message for Fennec Shand to find him should she need his services. What he found instead was an opportunity he had not expected. Boba Fett had claimed the territory once controlled by Jabba the Hutt and his successor, Bib Fortuna, and Boba needed allies to defend his new position. Before committing to help, Din decided he needed proper transportation. His inquiries led him back to Peli Motto's hangar in Mos Eisley, where the irrepressible mechanic greeted him with her usual mix of complaints and affection. She did not have a replacement for the Razor Crest, but she did have something unusual, a frame of a Naboo N-1 starfighter, the classic ship design that had been state-of-the-art decades ago during the Clone Wars era. Din was skeptical. The N-1 was built for speed and dogfighting, not for the practical needs of a bounty hunter who might need to transport cargo or prisoners. It had no sleeping quarters, minimal storage, and seated only one person. But Peli was enthusiastic about the possibilities, and lacking better options, Din agreed to help rebuild the ship. The work was therapeutic in its way. Din and Peli, along with her pit droids and some assistance from a couple of Jawas with spare parts, spent hours stripping down the N-1's frame and rebuilding it with modern components and custom modifications. They replaced the laser cannons with more powerful models, removed panels to reduce weight, installed a turbonic Venturi power assimilator from a Republic-era starfighter to boost the engines beyond their original specifications. As Din worked, his hands busy with tools and components, his mind kept returning to Grogu. The child would be with Luke Skywalker now, learning to use the Force, being trained in the ways of the Jedi. It was what needed to happen, what was best for Grogu's development. But the absence was a constant ache, an emptiness that no amount of rationalization could fill. The N1, when completed, was a masterpiece of speed and maneuverability. Din took it on a test flight through Beggar's Canyon, feeling the ship respond to his slightest touch on the controls. It was nothing like the Razor Crest, but in its own way, it was magnificent. When New Republic X-Wing pilots tried to stop him for flying too close to a commercial transport, Din activated the kineso switch Peli had installed, and the starfighter leaped forward with acceleration that left the patrol ships behind as if they were standing still. The war for Mos Espa. With his new ship, Din agreed to help Boba Fett defend his claim to Tatooine's criminal underworld. What followed was a complex series of political maneuvering and violent confrontations with the Pike Syndicate, which sought to control the spice trade through Mos Espa and saw Boba's independent operation as a threat to be eliminated. Din threw himself into the conflict with the dedication that had made him a successful bounty hunter, but his heart was never fully in it. He fought because Boba had helped rescue Grogu, because honor demanded he repay that debt, but the cause itself, the control of criminal territory on a backwater desert world, meant little to him. Before the final confrontation with the Pikes, Din made a decision that surprised even him. He flew his N1 to the coordinates where Luke Skywalker had established his Jedi temple, intending to visit Grogu. The droid R2-D2 greeted him, and Ahsoka Tano, who was visiting Luke, intercepted Din before he could reach the training grounds. Ahsoka explained that Grogu was struggling with his training, torn between the Jedi path and his attachment to Din. If Din appeared now, it would only make Grogu's choice harder. She was firm, but not unkind, as she suggested Din leave. He agreed, but not before asking her to give something to Grogu. A small shirt of Beskar chain mail that the armorer had forged from the spear. Armor to protect the child if danger found him. Din returned to Tatooine and joined the battle for Mos Espa. The fighting was fierce, with the Pike Syndicate deploying everything from infantry to massive Scorpionek annihilator droids. Din fought alongside Boba Fett, using his jetpack and weapons to devastating effect. But the battle seemed lost until reinforcements arrived from the people of Freetown, Tatooine's scattered communities rallying to Boba's cause. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Peli Motto appeared in a speeder, and with her was Grogu. The reunion happened in the middle of a battlefield, blaster fire echoing around him, but none of that mattered. Din looked at Grogu, and Grogu looked back, and the months of separation collapsed into irrelevance. The child had made his choice. Luke Skywalker, in his wisdom, had presented Grogu with a decision. Accept a lightsaber and continue training as a Jedi, or take the Beskar armor and return to Din. Grogu had chosen the armor. He had chosen Din. Din picked up the child, holding him with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence surrounding them, and for the first time in months, the emptiness that had haunted him filled with something like joy. The quest to return Grogu to his kind was over. The child had found his kind, and his kind was Din Djarin. Together, they helped turn the tide of the battle. Grogu's force abilities proved decisive when a rancor, driven mad by combat, rampaged through Mos Espa. The child calmed the beast through the force, preventing further destruction and demonstrating that while he might not have chosen the life of a Jedi, he was still incredibly powerful. With the battle won and Boba Fett's position secured, Din and Grogu departed Tatooine in the N1. Their reunion had created a problem, however. Din was still an apostate, exiled from his tribe for removing his helmet. And now he was caring for a foundling again, taking on responsibilities that traditionally required one to be Mandalorian in good standing. The solution, impossible as it seemed, remained the same. Din would have to journey to Mandalore and bathe in the living waters. He would have to set foot on a poisoned, cursed world that everyone believed was deadly to visit. He would have to find the ruins of the mines and descend to waters that might not even exist anymore. And now he would not be doing it alone. The cursed world Mandalore hung in space like a monument to tragedy, its surface scarred and barren, the once proud cities reduced to rubble and ruins. Din approached the planet with a combination of determination and dread, knowing that every Mandalorian who had attempted to return since the Purge had either died or fled before setting foot on the surface. Din's first stop was not Mandalore, but Kalevala, another world in the Mandalore system where Bo-Katan Kryze had established herself in isolated exile. Din found her sitting alone on her throne in a massive empty castle, a leader without followers, a warrior without a war to fight. Her forces had scattered after she lost the Darksaber to Moff Gideon and then saw Din win it from him. Without the saber, without a claim to leadership, Bo-Katan had been abandoned by those who had once followed her. Din explained his mission to reach the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore and achieve redemption. Bo-Katan was dismissive, calling it a fool's errand and questioning the extreme beliefs of the Children of the Watch. She had grown up on Mandalore, remembered when the living waters were just a ceremonial site for the royal family, nothing more. The idea that bathing in them could cleanse spiritual transgression was, in her view, superstition. But she did give him information. The entrance to the mines lay beneath the ruins of Sundari, Mandalore's capital city, in what had once been the civic center. If Din was determined to go, that was where he needed to start. Din and Grogu descended to Mandalore's surface in the N1, and what they found was both better and worse than expected. Better because the air, when tested by R5-D4, proved to be breathable. The planet was not the toxic wasteland rumors suggested. Worse, because the ruins of the great cities were haunting in their emptiness. Vast structures that had once housed millions now standing silent and abandoned. As Din explored the ruins, searching for the entrance to the mines, he was attacked and captured by a cyborg creature, some unfortunate being who had been trapped on Mandalore and modified themselves to survive in the hostile environment. The creature disabled Din and dragged him to its lair, intending to salvage his armor and equipment. Grogu, too small to fight the creature directly, did what Din had taught him. He went for help. The child flew the N1, his force abilities allowing him to pilot the ship despite his size and age, back to Kalevala. There, he found Bo-Katan and brought her back to Mandalore. Bo-Katan rescued Din from the creature, using the Darksaber that Din still carried to dispatch his captor. When Din regained consciousness, he immediately insisted on continuing to the living waters. Bo-Katan, now committed, despite her skepticism, agreed to guide him. The living waters. The journey through the ruined mines of Mandalore was treacherous, The bombardment that had devastated the surface had caused seismic instabilities below, creating chasms and collapses that made navigation difficult. But eventually, they found it, a great chamber deep beneath the surface, and within it, the living waters, still flowing despite everything the Empire had done to destroy Mandalore. A plaque on the wall told the history of the place, how these mines had once been a mythosaur lair, how Mandalore the Great had defeated and then ridden the legendary beast, how the skull of the mythosaur had become the symbol of their people. Bo-Katan read it aloud, though she misquoted slightly, saying Mandalore the Great had tamed the beast when the plaque actually said defeated and then rode. Din removed his weapons and jetpack, preparing himself for the ritual. He walked into the living waters, reciting the creed as he went, the words echoing in the vast chamber. I swear on my name and the names of the ancestors that I shall walk the way of the Mandalore, and the words of the creed shall be forever forged in my heart. As he spoke the final words, the ground beneath him gave way. The bombardment had hollowed out the chamber below, creating a chasm that had not existed when the living waters were last used for ceremony. Din plunged into the depths, unconscious from the impact and drowning in the dark water far below the surface. Bo-Katan did not hesitate. She dove in after him, her jetpack propelling her down into the darkness. She reached Din and began pulling him back toward the surface, using her jetpack to ascend through the flooded chasm. And then she saw it. In the depths, illuminated by the glow of her jetpack, was a mythosaur, not a skeleton, not a fossil, but a living creature of impossible size, its eyes opening to regard her with ancient alien intelligence. The legendary beasts that were supposed to be extinct, that existed only in symbols and stories, still lived in the waters beneath Mandalore. Bo-Katan said nothing about what she had seen. She brought Din to the surface, where he regained consciousness, confused about the depth he had fallen and the fact that Bo-Katan had saved him. He had no memory of the mythosaur. He had been unconscious when it appeared. Bo-Katan kept her secret, perhaps not trusting what she had seen, perhaps understanding that some revelations needed time to process. But Din had achieved his goal. He had bathed in the living waters. He had proof, a small container of the water itself, to show the armorer. According to the creed, he was redeemed. As they left the mines, TIE interceptors attacked, destroying Bo-Katan's castle on Kalevala in a coordinated assault. The Empire, it seemed, had not forgotten about Mandalore or the Mandalorians who still lived. Bo-Katan and Din fled together to the covert where Din's tribe had established themselves, and there both were accepted back into Mandalorian society. The armorer examined Din's proof from the living waters and declared him redeemed in the eyes of the creed. More than that, she acknowledged Bo-Katan's redemption as well, for she too had bathed in the living waters when she rescued Din. Bo-Katan, who had mocked the beliefs of the Children of the Watch, who had led armies and ruled Mandalore itself, was now welcomed into this small, secretive sect as an equal. When the armorer offered to forge new armor for Bo-Katan, the question arose of what signet to use. Bo-Katan asked about the mythosaur, explaining what she had seen in the depths. The armorer's response was cryptic but significant. When you choose to walk the way of the Mandalore, you will see many things. The vision of the mythosaur, the armorer suggested, was not just a random encounter, but a sign a portent of Bo-Katan's destiny as a potential leader of the Mandalorian people. The gathering, with both Din and Bo-Katan redeemed and accepted into the covert, something unexpected began to happen. Other Mandalorians started to arrive. Word had spread that Mandalore was not cursed, that the living waters still existed, that redemption was possible. Scattered survivors of the Purge, Mandalorians from various sects and traditions, began to make their way to the covert. Among them was a realization that began to shift the dynamic of Mandalorian society. The Children of the Watch, long dismissed as extremists and cultists, had been right about maintaining their traditions in secret. They had survived the Purge precisely because they had not been on Mandalore when the Empire attacked. Their rigid adherence to the old ways, their insistence on secrecy and survival above all else, had preserved something essential when mainstream Mandalorian society had been destroyed. But Bo-Katan brought something equally valuable: experience in leadership, knowledge of diplomacy and strategy, connections to Mandalorians who did not follow the strict interpretations of the Watch. Together, these different streams of Mandalorian culture began tentatively to merge. The process was not always smooth. Paz Vizsla, descendant of Tara Vizsla, who had created the Darksaber, challenged Din for the right to wield the blade. The duel that followed was fierce, both warriors equally matched in skill and determination. But Din ultimately prevailed, though he derived no satisfaction from the victory. He did not want the Darksaber. He did not want to lead the Mandalorian people. He wanted to raise Grogu and live in peace. The growing community faced external threats as well. Gorian Shard, a pirate king, attempted to intimidate the covert, not realizing that Mandalorians were not easily cowed. When Shard's forces attacked Navarro, Din led the covert in its defense, demonstrating that the scattered Mandalorians could work together when one of their own was threatened. Captain Carson Teva of the New Republic, recognizing Din's skills and his position within the Mandalorian community, began offering him jobs that served both the New Republic's interests and the Mandalorians' need for resources. These arrangements were unofficial, allowing Din to maintain his independence while contributing to galactic stability in the chaotic post-Empire era. The final battle, the peace, such as it was, could not last. Moff Gideon, who was supposed to be in a New Republic prison, had been freed by Imperial commandos wearing armor made of Beskar alloy, an impossible material that suggested someone had access to Mandalorian metallurgy. Investigation revealed that Gideon had established a secret base on Mandalore itself, hidden in the ruins, where he was conducting cloning experiments and mining Beskar to equip his forces. The revelation unified the Mandalorians as nothing else could have. Their homeworld, already violated by the Purge, was being used as a base by the very man who had orchestrated that destruction. It was intolerable, an insult that demanded response regardless of cost. Bo-Katan, now openly acknowledged as a leader by multiple Mandalorian factions, planned an assault on Gideon's base. Din stood with her, the Darksaber still on his belt, though he increasingly saw it as Bo-Katan's by right. The gathered Mandalorians, representing the largest concentration of their people since the Purge, prepared for battle. The assault on Mandalore was everything the stakes suggested it would be: desperate, violent, and costly. Gideon had prepared well, with advanced Imperial technology, clone troopers in Beskar armor, and his own enhanced Dark Trooper suit that made him nearly unstoppable in personal combat. Din and Grogu infiltrated Gideon's base while Bo-Katan led the main assault. The fighting was brutal, room by room, corridor by corridor. Gideon's Praetorian guards, elite warriors in crimson armor, engaged Din while Gideon himself confronted Bo-Katan. In the final confrontation, Gideon seemed on the verge of victory. He crushed the darksaber with his bare hands, shattering the ancient weapon and the symbol of Mandalorian leadership it represented. But Din and Grogu returned just in time, and as axe woves crashed a Mandalorian capital ship into the base, Grogu used the Force to create a protective shield around himself, Din, and Bo-Katan. The resulting explosion consumed Moff Gideon, the architect of the Great Purge, the man who had caused so much suffering to the Mandalorian people, died in flames on the very world he had helped destroy. It was not redemption for what he had done, but it was justice of a kind. The new beginning. In the aftermath of Gideon's death, the Mandalorians began the long process of reclaiming their world. The armorer relit the Great Forge, the legendary furnace where Beskar had been worked for generations, marking the beginning of Mandalore's rebirth. Mandalorians from across the galaxy began returning, not to hide or to wage war, but to rebuild. Bo-Katan assumed leadership, not through the darksaber, which was destroyed, but through the trust of her people and her proven dedication to their survival and renewal. The various sects and traditions of Mandalorian culture, from the Children of the Watch to the more secular factions, found ways to coexist and even cooperate. For Din Djarin, the future was clearer than it had been in years. He had achieved redemption in the eyes of the Creed. He had helped save Mandalore from a threat that could have destroyed what little remained of his people. He had proven himself worthy of the armor he wore and the responsibilities it represented. But most importantly, he had Grogu, the child who had transformed his life, who had taught him that there were things worth caring about beyond simple survival, was still with him, still looking up at him with those enormous eyes that held such trust and affection. In a ceremony before the gathered Mandalorians, with the armorer presiding, Din formally adopted Grogu according to Mandalorian tradition. "I, Din Djarin, take this foundling into my care," he declared. "Let it be written in song that Din Djarin is accepting this foundling as his son." The armorer completed the ritual. "You are now Din Grogu, Mandalorian apprentice." The child had a name that reflected both his heritage and his chosen family. Din Grogu, the foundling who would be raised as a Mandalorian, trained in the ways of his people, part of an unbroken chain stretching back thousands of years. Din Djarin's path had been long and painful. He had lost his birth family to war, found a new family among the Mandalorians, lost his community in the Purge, wandered alone as a bounty hunter, found unexpected purpose in protecting a child, lost that child to the Jedi, been exiled from his people for breaking the Creed, achieved redemption, and finally found a place where he belonged. He had gone from Din the orphan to Din the Mandalorian to Din the apostate to Din Djarin, father and warrior, a man with a family and a purpose. The trauma of Akvatina would always be part of him. The memory of his parents dying to save him would never fully fade. But he had transformed that trauma into something constructive, had taken the pain of loss and used it to ensure that another foundling would not grow up alone and afraid. As Din and Grogu departed Mandalore in the N1 starfighter, beginning their journeys as Mandalorian apprentice and teacher, they carried with them the legacy of their people. The Mandalorians had been broken, scattered, nearly destroyed, but they endured, they adapted, they survived. This is the way. The history of Din Djarin is, in many ways, the history of the Mandalorian people themselves in the New Republic era. Both experienced devastating loss, were scattered and presumed destroyed, endured in isolation and secrecy, and ultimately found a path to renewal through honoring both tradition and adaptation. Din's story teaches that identity is not fixed, but can be chosen and earned. He was not born Mandalorian, but he became one through adoption, training, and dedication to the creed. His journey from lonely bounty hunter to devoted father demonstrates that even the most isolated souls can find connection and purpose. His relationship with Grogu embodies the central Mandalorian value that defines them as a culture. Foundlings are sacred, children without protection must be defended, and family is not about blood, but about choice and commitment. The clan of two, Din Djarin and Din Grogu, represents both the smallest possible Mandalorian unit and the essential core of what makes them who they are. Din's conflicts with the Darksaber, with leadership, with the responsibilities that came unbidden to his door, reflect a man who never sought power or status, but found himself burdened with both through circumstances and merit. His willingness to step aside, to let Bo-Katan lead, even as he technically held claim to the Darksaber, shows wisdom beyond what his solitary life might have suggested he possessed. The living waters, the redemption, the return to Mandalore, all of these represent something profound, that even when everything seems lost, when a world is literally poisoned and cursed, renewal is possible if one is willing to risk everything to achieve it. Din's faith in the possibility of redemption, even when his own leader believed it impossible, made that redemption real. In the years to come, Din Grogu will grow under his father's guidance, learning the Mandalorian ways while retaining his connection to the Force. He will be something new, a Mandalorian who can also use the abilities of the Jedi, a bridge between two ancient traditions that have often been at odds. What he will become, only time will tell. But he will face the future not alone, but as part of a clan, raised by a father who understands both loss and love, trained by a people who have survived everything the galaxy could throw at them. Din Djarin has given Din Grogu what was given to him on Concordia all those years ago: a home, a family, a purpose. The cycle continues. The way endures. And in a galaxy still recovering from decades of war and tyranny, one Mandalorian and his foundling son fly toward whatever adventures await them, bound together by bonds stronger than Beskar, carrying forward traditions thousands of years old. This is their story. This is the way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete history of Din Djarin, the Mandalorian warrior who became a father and helped save his people, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. We'll continue exploring the rich lore of the Star Wars galaxy, from the ancient Sith to the heroes and villains of every era. May the Force be with you, and may you walk the way with honor. This is the way.